Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
I don't know where to come on this. I think I'll start with admissions. I'll start with mea culpas before I start putting the boot into anybody else. Because I used to be accused of anti-Semitism quite often whenever I spoke about Israel foreign policy. And it's such a cutting accusation that it works. It silences you. Even when, in retrospect, I wasn't saying anything that was discriminating against or contingent upon the ethnicity or the religion of the people I was criticising. I hope he doesn't mind me telling you, but I asked Martin Lewis for advice on this, the money-saving expert, and he told me that it would be much wiser to confine one's criticisms to individuals and institutions rather than the whole country. And when you think about it, that makes perfect sense. So I criticise Benjamin Netanyahu's foreign policy. I criticise some of his associations in the Knesset. I criticise some of the decisions taken by his government with regard to the Golan Heights or the occupied territories. And I appreciate some people don't like that either. And I understand them now better than I ever did. But I also understand how it works on the other side of the debate. I have a profound and heartbreaking understanding of how you can do it the other way round as well. You can be anti-Semitic and you can then camouflage your anti-Semitism by claiming that you're criticising the modern state of Israel. Which is why Jeremy Corbyn is in unprecedented trouble this morning. Although the people I describe or have described in the past as cultists will not see it that way. And by cultists, I mean people who, in the words of George Orwell, have been conditioned to ignore the evidence of their own eyes and ears. That was the party's final, most terrible command. Because here it is. Here is Jeremy Corbyn writing a foreword for a book that is pretty much, if you were to instruct a computer algorithm to assemble all of the ancient tropes of anti-Semitism between two hardback covers, they would pretty much come up with J.A. Hobson's imperialism, or parts of it. And back in 2000 and... get the year right, 11, so only 8 years ago, a bunch of publishers in London sat around and determined to republish this book. A book that essentially accused the Jews of running everything, owning everything, fomenting war and hatred to further their own financial gains. And as they sat in that room and ran through presumably a list of people who might be amenable to the idea of endorsing or supporting this book, the name that popped out of the bottom of their deliberations was Jeremy Corbyn MP, back then a little-known backbencher with a reputation for voting against his own whip on a dizzyingly regular basis. No problem with that. He describes the book as brilliant. He describes it as a fantastic tome. And in this book, we read that finance in Europe was controlled by men of a single and peculiar race. And we read this book, which was published in 1902, with a little reminder in the back of our head that the modern state of Israel did not exist in 1902. So here is Jeremy Corbyn, unable, or his followers, utterly unable to conflate criticism of the modern state of Israel with bile directed at Jews. Because the modern state of Israel did not exist in 1902. So endorsing a book which talks of finance in Europe being controlled by men of a single and peculiar race is not criticism of Benjamin Netanyahu. It's not criticism of Israeli foreign policy. It's not criticism of the treatment of the Palestinian people. It's not criticism of the Likud party. It is racial hatred of a single and peculiar race. And it was endorsed by the leader of the Labour Party. Which means that today is the day that you choose between the evidence of your own eyes and ears or between blind, cultish devotion. And if you're choosing blind, cultish devotion, I'd really like to talk to you today. And I'd really like to hear your attempts to persuade me that it's not blind, cultish devotion in which you indulge. It's something altogether more nuanced and transparent. And the phone lines are open. 03456060973. The rejection of the Labour Party membership's desire for a second referendum is moot today. The fact that the man has turned out to be neither democratic nor concerned particularly with the thoughts of the membership is moot for the purposes of our conversation today. I'm also, as I mentioned in my introduction, a little uncomfortable with the full rules and regulations, the complicated roster of rules regarding election periods. So we'll focus on this. Rothschilds. Does anyone seriously suppose that a great war could be undertaken by any European state or a great state loan subscribed if the House of Rothschild and its connections set their face against it? This is the book that Jeremy Corbyn has described as brilliant. He writes himself in the foreword that the book is correct and prescient, railing against the commercial interests that fuel the role of the popular press with tales of imperial might. And he is the leader in this country of the party that is supposed to represent the interests of the oppressed and the discriminated against and the minority. And here he is. A Labour Party spokesman, because the chances of Jeremy Corbyn appearing in public to defend him this himself are zero. Because that's the great Democrat. That's the great transparent and accountable, refreshing change to a kinder and gentler politics, who will not appear in public to defend this and whose fans will now use it as an excuse to justify his failure to be held to account or scrutinised in public. Because Seamus Milne, his Director of Communications, remains in the background telling him what he can and can't say. Not just telling Jeremy Corbyn what he can and can't say, but as television footage demonstrated yesterday, telling Keir Starmer, the Shadow Secretary of State for Brexit, what he can and can't say. Seamus Milne, I would remind you, has been elected by precisely nobody. He has, however, been filmed on stage with Vladimir Putin. And he has spoken and written extensively in the past about his admiration for Joseph Stalin. This is what the Labour Party said last night. Jeremy praised the liberal Hobson's century-old classic study of imperialism in Africa and Asia. Similar to other books of its era, Hobson's work contains outdated and offensive references and observations, and Jeremy completely rejects the anti-Semitic element of his analysis, which of course poses one simple and powerful question. Why didn't Jeremy mention this in the introduction that he wrote? Why didn't Jeremy mention that he completely rejects the anti-Semitic elements of an analysis that he described in black and white as brilliant? And why are you letting him get away with this? You, who are committed to a party that stands up for the rights of the discriminated against and the oppressed. Why are you sticking up for a man who has described as brilliant a book which runs through the vilest and oldest of anti-Semitic tropes as if they were going out of fashion? Why? 0345 6060 973. And how are you going to do it today? How are you going to justify it today? Let you down on Brexit, let you down on a second referendum, and now it emerges 8 years ago he was writing fan letters to vile, centuries-old anti-Semitism. 0345 6060 973. And the sense of betrayal that people feel today is probably confined to people who've been trying to persuade themselves that what was in front of them wasn't true. The people who have already sold their souls, sacrificed their integrity, their honesty and their decency upon the altar of I don't know what anymore. I don't know what anymore. I never saw what you could see. But I always believed there must be something there and that the fault lay with me. I just need to look a little harder. I need to dig a little deeper. I need to work a little more, and it will become clear to me because so many people I liked and respected told me that this man was different. He was worthy, not just of their support, but of mine. And because I had this odd legacy of being accused of anti-Semitism myself, successfully accused in the sense that it made me bite my tongue. It made me stop criticising some of the policies undertaken by the Likud party in Israel during the period of time that I've had this job. Because the accusation is so vile, I think I lent towards sympathy and support. You can't throw anti-Semitism around as an accusation designed to stifle debate about Middle Eastern politics, and yet people do. But that, of course, creates one side of a coin, upon the other side of which appears the attempt to conflate every criticism of, well, I'm afraid every example of anti-Semitism as somehow being designed to stifle criticism of Israel, which is why this date is so important, 1902. Why was he writing then about the brilliant analysis of finance in Europe being controlled by men of a single and peculiar race, if it's all about the oppression of the Palestinian people? Riddle me that on 0345 6060 973. Why, before the formation of the modern state of Israel, was Jeremy Corbyn impressed by the analysis of a man who claimed that imperialism was driven by finance, which he said was controlled by men of a single and peculiar race who are in a unique position to control the policy of nations? And if you misunderstand, or perhaps if you're pretending to misunderstand this, this is what the right are doing with George Soros today. The shooting in the synagogue this weekend was undertaken by a man who had spoken of his subscription to the school of thought we saw on the streets of Charlottesville. Jews will not replace us, they chanted shortly before Donald Trump described the good people on both sides. Jews will not replace us. The idea that the migrant caravan, the so-called migrant caravan, was making its way towards the American border through Central and Southern America, it was put out there by the right-wing media that George Soros was somehow funding it. George Soros is Jewish. Viktor Orban in Hungary paid people to come up with a bête noire, a target, a scapegoat, around which he could muster nationalistic feeling, which would allow him to further his nationalistic and authoritarian regime. It happens on the right. People like me, naive, foolish, dreamy, idealistic, never thought it happened on the left. Even when it's pointed out that Stalinist philosophy on paper is communist, it's left-wing in essence, you very quickly point out that's about as relevant to the distinction between left and right as the fact that Hitler chose to call his party the National Socialists. About as socialist, of course, as the Democratic Republic of North Korea is democratic. But people still do it. And the reason they do it is because it posits an enemy. Once you've posited an enemy, you can get people to do whatever you want them to do in defense of their own interests, even if the enemy doesn't exist. If you turn to me now and you say, oh, well, hang on, there's a newspaper that is owned by someone who's Jewish, and that proves nothing. Here's a financier who is Jewish. That proves nothing, any more than it would if they were a Capricorn, or an Aries, or a Sagittarius. So today we sit in Britain in 2019 and we see the leader of Her Majesty's opposition describing as brilliant an analysis that essentially portrayed Jews as causing wars to make money. I'm not sure I want to take calls today. Paperback of my book's out in June. I took a call from the publisher last night. They said, would you mind writing an introduction for another book? It's been written by a massive anti-Semite from the turn of the last century. I'm only joking. But if I did, you know what I'd say. You know what you would say. No. I very, very, very rarely wish I could swear on the radio. Today is one of those days. Hi, James. We've got this book from 1902 written by a massive, stone-cold anti-Semite. He's blaming the Jews for everything, starting wars, running the banks, running the media. Any chance of you writing a positive introduction to it? No. Irving's in Pinner. Irving, what's going on?
Well, I think you have to look at Corbyn's political background and where he was before he became leader of the opposition. He comes from a background with a hatred for the West, a hatred for what he sees as imperialism, a hatred of the USA and any of the USA's allies, of which Israel is one, and a hatred of aspiration.
I'm going to stop you there with respect.
Yeah.
This book was written in 1902, so I'm not talking about the modern state of Israel today. And I have a hatred of some of the things you've described. The excesses of imperialism sicken me to my stomach. The way that there's a great thing on social media the other day where an African lad said he's discovered a river. It's in London, but he's going to call it the Gulu River. And I suddenly realised that's what we spent centuries doing, going around the world, discovering things that other people already live next door to. So let's just leave Israel out of it.
No, because I think...
Well, you can carry on not leaving Israel out of it, but I won't talk to you anymore.
Fair enough. So you have this attitude... Let's go back to the conspiracy theory. It's tied up with the conspiracy theory. The idea is that the Jews are responsible for this, that, and the other. Interestingly enough... But
I know all this.
The tropes in that book are very similar to the Hamas Charter, which holds the Jews responsible for both world wars, the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. Yes. And the point is that if you
anyone who doubts what you're saying, who perhaps hasn't read the book or checked some of the... I haven't read the book, I should be clear, and crikey, even I can't read that fast. This is what he says, okay? There is not a war, a revolution, an anarchist assassination, or any other public shock which is not gainful to these men. They are harpies who suck their gains from every new forced expenditure and every sudden disturbance of public credit. The direct influence is exercised by great financial houses in high politics is supported by the control which they exercise over the body of public opinion through the press. So I would once have argued with you. I would once have said, wind your neck in, Irving, it's not that bad. But there it is. It's a great tome. It's a brilliant analysis. And it's about the world and wars and revolutions, everything being started by Jews.
James, I'm Jewish. We're on the same side. I'm not disagreeing with you. But yet the point is, Corbyn, I don't think he's got the intellect to to understand what he's doing. Does he actually think, had he read the book, had he thought about what he's doing?
He must have read the book. No one would write an introduction for a book if they hadn't read it, so he must agree with what's in it. And that's when today, let me read you this quote again. Make sure I've got it right. Jeremy praised the liberal Hobson's century-old classic study of imperialism in Africa and Asia. Similarly to other books of its era, Hobson's work contains outdated and offensive references and observations, and Jeremy completely rejects the anti-Semitic elements of his analysis. So why didn't Jeremy say so?
Well, that's something he's not going to answer because his puppeteers won't let him say that, won't let him answer that. The point is, he hasn't moved, James, he hasn't moved on. He's where he was.
I'm not arguing. Again, you're in complete agreement. I think what I'm looking for now is just something new, or not a defence necessarily, but just something that allows it to be cast in a way that doesn't provide incontrovertible evidence that all of the most important accusations levelled against him over the last few years, since that mural appeared, and there must be people sitting at home now thinking, James, the mural. Simon's in Hampstead. Simon, what would you like to say?
Yeah, it's a very depressing subject, this whole...
Can I pause you there? Sorry, I've got a right old bee in my bonnet today. People don't care enough, do they, Simon? That's the calculation. That's the calculation they've taken. That's the Jewish experience through the centuries. People don't care. Here is stone cold proof that he admires a massive anti-Semite. For all his mealy-mouthed words, people don't care enough. They don't think it's going to have an electoral impact.
I think it goes even wider than the anti-Semitism thing, which is... there was a historian called Eric Hobsbawm.
Yes, of course.
And he did an interview. Basically, he was asked whether the deaths of millions and millions of people in the Soviet Union under Stalin was a price worth paying for the establishment of the perfect society as he saw it. And he basically said yes. It was worth it. And the problem is that if you've got this sort of Manichaean view, which is, good is anti-imperialism, anti-Semitism, because the Jews are at the back of everything, as the hard left likes to believe. And on the other hand, you've got imperialism, you've got America, the West. Then this is the dark alley down which you are led. And it is very, very dangerous. And the problem is that in the past, this has been very much locked in a far left cupboard. Corbyn and people like him were a tiny minority within the Labour Party. And now him...
They had a Jewish leader 4 years ago.
Exactly. But, the point was that, there was a strong relationship between British Labour and Labour in Israel. It was a mainstream centre-left socialist, democratic party. It is now no longer that. And the people who pull the strings, and people who, just from the writings of Seamus Milne, not casting aspersions, but just on what he's written on the record, what he said in interviews.
On stage with Vladimir Putin.
It tells you everything you need to know. And I think, for example, to bring it down to a rather trite, somewhat banal level, is if, for example, Putin was attending a state dinner at Buckingham Palace, I've got a strong suspicion that Jeremy Corbyn would attend, whereas he won't attend, and I detest Trump myself, but he won't attend with the leader of the United States. This is of a piece. This is not surprising, and if people are surprised, then they need to wake up and smell the coffee. They really do.
Surprise is a brilliant word to use this morning, because I don't know what words to use to describe my feelings. Dismay? I think I am surprised, and I'm sorry that I'm surprised, because I thought that up until this point, we took a call, Simon, about 2 years ago when we first started talking. I think it came out after the mural, and it was a young woman, and I mention her class simply because it usually suggests a certain degree of education, whether privately or otherwise. But she was quite posh and quite young. Big Labour supporter, very on side with Corbyn. And she said to me, and I've never forgotten this, she said, it's not anti-Semitic, James, whatever we were discussing at the time. She said, because the Jews really do control the media. And that was an incredibly illuminating moment for me in all of the most horrible ways, because it allowed me to understand how people could arrive at a conclusion so utterly wrong and potentially evil while thinking that they were somehow on the side of the angels.
This is the point. They do believe they are on the side of the angels, and therefore anything that they maintain is the truth and is justified. And this is the problem. It is this, good for evil, and they really see themselves as the good guys, and they're far from it. And it leads to authoritarianism, it leads to intolerance, it leads to hate. And I think they're as bad as the far right.
They're identical. This is Soros. This is what people do with Soros. Anybody who has attempted to portray George Soros as having designs upon Western democracy, or trying to subvert, or trying to overthrow the indigenous population or the white, and we've heard it all. I've heard it very, very close to home, tragically. But
Viktor Orban, in Hungary, that's where you get to.
Jews will not replace us. They were chanting on the streets of Charlottesville after just before Donald Trump galloped to their defence. Jews will not replace us. The shootings in the Californian synagogue this very weekend were undertaken by somebody whose social media presence suggests that he believes the stuff about George Soros funding a migrant caravan. And here is the early 20th century equivalent of that rhetoric.
Yeah. Just one final thing, recommending a book which casts light on the mindset. It's a book by David Aronovich, and it's called Party Animals. And it's basically because David grew up in a family whose parents were both members of the Communist Party of Great Britain, and it's a wonderful book, and it really does show you the mindset of these people. And David has gone on a very, very long journey. He's somebody I admire hugely, and it's worth reading in terms of trying to understand where these people's minds are at and how dangerous they are. Yeah,
you're right, and that's why he has perhaps been one of the canaries down the coal mine about the influence of Seamus Milne on the modern Labour Party. Similarly, Nick Cohen, of course, writing in The Observer and elsewhere. 10:31 is the time. I hate this. This isn't why I do this for a living. This isn't one of those days where even if we have a massive ding-dong and a set-to and a big fight, it's great fun and it's showbiz and it's pantomime. I just feel dirty today. God knows how people are going to vote in the coming years. Be lighting a candle tonight to mark Yom HaShoah, commemorate those who died in the Holocaust. And and we're discussing the Labour leader's decision in 2011 to describe as a great tome and a brilliant analysis a book which laid the blame for pretty much every war that's ever happened at the feet of the Jewish financiers. 2 Labour candidates for the local council elections was suspended for sharing Rothschild conspiracy theories on social media. And the leader of the Labour Party described as brilliant a book that states, does anyone seriously suppose that a great war could be undertaken by any European state or a great state loan subscribed if the House of Rothschild and its connections set their face against it? Theo Ashwood is here with more news.
We have a fourth arrest, according to the Metropolitan Police, in connection with allegations of anti-Semitism by Labour Party members. Now, these allegations were contained within an internal dossier, which was obtained by LBC and subsequently passed to the Metropolitan Police Commissioner back in September. As a result of that, there was a review of the evidence, the initial evidence by the Crown Prosecution Service, and it was decided that there should be a full criminal investigation. 3 arrests were made in March, and now we have the arrest of a 44-year-old man who was detained this morning on an offence contrary to Section 19 of the Public Order Act 1986, publishing or distributing material likely to stir up racial hatred. He was arrested in Newham, East London, and he is currently in police custody helping detectives with their inquiries.
And what do we know about the internal investigation system, which was what, of course, first alerted you to these potential problems?
So this dossier was detailing allegations against members of the Labour Party at the time. And they contained the names of those individuals, they contained what they were alleged to have done and their defence, because they'd been approached in each case, and then whether they had been suspended from the party or were going to be allowed to continue pending further inquiries. Now, this dossier was never passed to the police. This was never handed to the police. We got hold of it. We had it reviewed by a man called Mac Chishti, who was the commander of the Metropolitan Police's hate crime unit up until 2017. He found that there were 4 cases, in his opinion, that crossed the threshold for a criminal investigation. Another 17 crossed the threshold to be recorded by police as potential race hate incidences. And as a result of that, we passed it to the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Cressida Dick, who said she would look into it. But the point that was made by Mac Chishti was that that this was something that warranted a police investigation, or a number of these cases warranted a police investigation, but these were never passed on to the Metropolitan Police. And indeed, many of those who were under investigation were allowed to continue as members without being suspended.
Excuse me, sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. And modesty aside, would these investigations have seen the light of day if it wasn't for your work?
Not necessarily, no.
I love you, mate. That's just the opposite of me. No.
I don't... Well, no. I mean, this was an internal dossier that was never meant to
And we should
out.
wait to see how the investigations unfold.
Yeah,
but, of course, we are today discussing the correct and prescient anti-Semitic analysis, those words, correct and prescient, employed by Jeremy Corbyn when describing a writer who blamed Jews for pretty much every war in living memory and the Rothschilds for bankrolling it.
The allegation that has often been laid at the feet of Jeremy Corbyn when it comes to anti-Semitism is that he doesn't do enough, and those around him do not do enough to root out anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. That when these cases come to light, the individuals aren't kicked out quickly, that the investigations take too long, that those who are trying to investigate these claims, and those individuals have come out, and many of them have since left the Labour Party, are hampered and hindered from doing so. And then when you put the evidence alongside the story you're discussing this morning, a picture starts to build up of perhaps why Jeremy Corbyn and those around him don't particularly feel the inclination to investigate very serious allegations of anti-Semitism seriously.
And we will continue to discuss it and keep an eye on those investigations. You're coming back for the PMQs?
Yes.
What an embarrassment of riches. We'll see you at 12:45. What are we expecting today? God knows. I mean, what an almighty... Do you want to know how bad things are? And this happened in public, so I don't think I'm betraying any confidences. No. You know that old line, cock up or conspiracy?
Yes.
I forgot that this morning and thought I'd invented it. So I asked on Twitter, I said, the weirdest thing about British politics at the moment is that you don't know whether what's happening is happening as a result of some sinister hidden agenda or whether it's just happening through base incompetence and ignorance. And the deputy leader of the Labour Party replied and said, why can't it be both?
It's extraordinary times.
Jack's in Battersea to bring some reason to proceedings. Jack, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How are you?
Very well, thank you. What's on your mind?
So, James, basically, I wouldn't normally call the radio, to be honest, but I was just compelled to. I felt that, what you said earlier, in your opening statement for your radio show was incredibly poignant, and it made me feel good that somebody out there is speaking the truth, really, about what this is. I'm nervous to call, but I've had anti-Semitism in my life since I was a kid. I'm Jewish. My dad is Jewish. My mum is Jewish. However, I've never stepped foot in a synagogue. So just the fact that I'm of that faith has caused people to just make innuendos, subtle insults, everything from as small as, being a tight ass, excuse my language, but...
Yeah, I spoke to Howard Jacobson about this last year in a podcast, and I think many of us don't realise what's happening. And then, of course, you have this new thing about, you can't take offence, you can't give offence, you can only take it, and you're all snowflakes, and you should be able to say whatever you want, and, all that kind of thing. And you look back on your life, and you realise just how commonplace it was. At my school, and I've said this on air before, but I just want anyone who doesn't understand what you mean when you use that phrase, tight-arse. At my school, when rolling your own cigarettes was very popular, if you put a tiny amount of tobacco in a cigarette, it was called a Jew roll.
Yeah, exactly.
And I bow to no one with my liberal, tolerant credentials, but that didn't even bleep on my radar of racism. Didn't even bleep. And that's what you're talking about, isn't it? I'm not excusing it. I'm just pointing out the difference between ignorance and culpability.
Well, I've accepted that level of anti-Semitism my whole life, but I have also had... I went to an English boarding school, private English boarding school. I'm not going to say which one it was. And, I felt compelled to... I wasn't even religious, but I felt compelled to wear a Star of David around my neck, because I really just wanted to stand up for who I was. I felt like I had to do it. Subsequently, a Nazi sign was carved on my bunk bed. I told the housemaster about it. And, he just said something along the lines of boys will be boys. And we moved on. Nothing was done about it. And still to this day, I get the odd comment here and there. But nothing bothers me more than a Labour politician standing up and saying what he's, not just on this occasion, but on occasions before. All these things just annoy me. And the only reason, to answer your question, which you asked on the radio before, why are people buying into this? Why is this being allowed to happen? Well, I think, to be honest with you, there are people out there that share these views. There's
also a simplicity to it. There's a simplism, actually. That's a nicer word. A simplism to it, in that Corbyn has achieved the leadership of the Labour Party upon a platform of positive policies. The idea being that he's going to heal the sick and enrich the poor and punish the plutocrats, and he's going to do all of these things. And you then need a scapegoat for everything that is bad. Some of it will be to do with media ownership. Some of it will be to do with the interests of plutocrats and very rich people and the influence they wield over politicians and society. Some of it will be to do with the successful mission to persuade people to vote against their own interests. Really complicated stuff. Some of it will probably be to do with human nature. Some of it will be historical inevitability. But you can't campaign on that platform. You can't campaign on that reading of society, because it's nuanced and complicated and debatable and difficult. You can campaign on the Jews run everything, and that's why everything is awful. That's my analysis, Jack. Make of it what you will.
I agree with you on that one. All I will say is that I hope, just like me in boarding school, when I put that Star of David around my neck, not even having read the Torah, having stepped in a synagogue in my whole life, I stood up to something that I believed in. I hope there are people out there, I hope there are people listening to your show that are taking all this on board. And at the very least, come out of yourselves and say something, do something. Don't vote for the guy, for God's sake. I mean, vote for anybody else besides this guy. This guy needs to leave. We cannot have somebody in power It's like Trump and the white supremacy. I just don't understand how these people are in power. It infuriates me.
I've just told you. I think I've just told you, and I appreciate its simplism, but I think I've just told you. You persuade people that there's something over there acting against their interests. You terrify them. You terrorise them. You come out with lines like "Jews will not replace us" in the context of anti-Semitism, or you talk about Muslims wanting to take over Europe, or you talk about immigrants swamping us and overrunning us, and you rise fast. I sense that, like me, you didn't think the left did this, and that possibly makes us naive, but I'd rather be naive than evil, Jack. 10:47 is the time. And it is, according to Jeremy Corbyn, a great tome. Imperialism by J.A. Hobson. Not a historian that most of us would have been extensively familiar with prior to Daniel Finkelstein, actually, at the Times, who has unearthed this. But he wrote a foreword, spoke about the brilliant analysis of a book which describes the Jews as having been responsible for, and let's get this absolutely right, there is not a war, a revolution, an anarchist assassination, or any other public shock which is not gainful to these men. They are harpies who suck their gains from every new forced expenditure and every sudden disturbance of public credit. It's not even debatable. And that's someone with a brain like mine and a conscience like mine. That's what's heartbreaking about this. It's so stark. And yet people I love and like will still be ramping up their blinkers this morning. Breaking news for you. The government's just cancelled those ferry contract. Well, I'd have to get that explained to you. You remember Chris Grayling's money for ferries for companies that didn't exist, and then as a result of that, he had to give money to them, and then the Channel Tunnel people got upset. They've all been cancelled now. Good old Chris Grayling. We'll find out how much that costs taxpayers, indeed, if it does, because they spent millions buying ferry capacity to prepare for the possibility of a no-deal departure from the EU at the end of March, which then didn't happen, but it turned out that they were going to have to pay the money anyway. We'll get to the bottom of that in a moment. But back to Jeremy Corbyn. Nate's in Crawley. Nate, what would you like to say?
First of all, I just want to say it's a bit heartbreaking, especially what you just read out. I mean, that was really shocking to me, actually.
Did you ring in to defend him?
No, I do want to say that I don't think he's an anti-Semite. However,
there is not a war, a revolution, an anarchist assassination, or any other public shock which is not gainful to these men. They are harpies who suck their gains from every new forced expenditure and every sudden disturbance of public credit.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is that I don't think he's an anti-Semite, even though what he did was still wrong. I don't think he's an anti-Semite. But I think what's usually happening in politics nowadays is that I think people are sometimes blinded by their political ideology to such an extent that when they see someone agrees with them on something so very much important, they are willing to ignore the other bad things that they believe in. Men
of a single and peculiar race control finance in Europe, he wrote. And Jeremy Corbyn thought, do you know what I fancy doing today? Writing a real fan letter to this dude.
Yeah, but that's the point I'm trying to make, is that those anti-Semite comments are terrible, but in Jeremy Corbyn's mind, or in most ideologues' mind, they seem to think that that doesn't matter that much if they believe that the other ideological aspect is more important.
I don't think I'm going to argue with you, Nate. But what you're talking about is closing your eyes to the truth, to all of the truth, because some elements of what you consider to be the truth are so seductive. I disagree with you now, for what it's worth. I think that the evidence of anti-Semitism in its basest form is now incontrovertible in this case.
No, but that's the point.
But I understand what you're saying. You're saying he held his nose about the anti-Semitism because he liked other bits of Hobson's analysis.
Exactly.
Why didn't he say so, Nate?
I don't. I mean, you have to ask him that reason.
I'd love to ask him that, mate. We've had an open invitation onto this programme since the day he was elected Labour leader, and I take Jip every day for being a Corbynite lefty on social media. He won't talk to people, mate. Why don't you think he's not out there today defending himself? You tell me briefly.
I have no idea.
Well, have a little think. Let's work it out. Why wouldn't he?
Probably because he believes that it's indefensible, probably because he's probably trying to figure out a way to get out of it.
Probably because Seamus Milne has told him not to.
Yeah, exactly.
Locked him in the toilet.
Probably he's hoping that, it'll probably blow over.
Yeah, and it probably will.
And the problem, but one of the things I've actually realised among political discussions is that I'm actually seeing this more and more and more, that people held the nose on certain aspects to hold on to some ideological aspect. Like, I'm a person of colour in the UK, for example.
Yes.
And more often than not, I see this happen across the parties. And it's really heartbreaking, because I just want to reach to a point where we're able to criticize certain aspects without demonizing other groups of people
I'll tell you what I think you're saying, if I've understood you correctly, and it's very close to my own heart, this. We should talk about the way that people like this talk about Rothschild in the same way that we talk about how people on the right talk about Soros. It's the same evil. It's the same trope. It's the same anti-Semitic propaganda that's been punted by Viktor Orban and anybody in British public life who has criticised George Soros in very strong terms.
But just like how some people on the right are blinded.
Are you hiding in a cupboard?
No, but I'm at work.
All right, okay. I can hear the door squeaking. I thought you were hiding in the stationery cupboard down there.
No,
I think we agree. We need a baseline of disapproval. There should be things that whatever side you're on, whatever team you've subscribed to, we all agree are wrong, and that's what's disappeared.
But that's probably, like, people will not know that because people believe in they believe that they're so morally pure that whatever they say is true. And I see this all the time post conversations. Like, for example, you see this on the right, for example, that someone, Jacob Rees-Mogg, can retweet that German right wing, whatever, just because they are against the European Union, or just because they speak against the European Union, but they don't think and process, hold on, okay, this person is speaking against the European Union. However, let's be honest, this party is also a racist Islamophobia party. It doesn't click to them. To them, they've realised that I'm
not going to disagree with you. So this is why people don't care enough, because if it hurts the other side in this world where everybody has to have a pungent opinion about everything, whether they understand anything or not, if it hurts the other side, then it's okay. Racism is okay. Anti-Semitism is okay. Islamophobia is okay. Discrimination is okay if it hurts the other side. And you can hate me for this if you want. I associate that with very right-wing people. Now it's leached into almost every aspect of British politics except what they call centrism, which they've turned into a dirty word. So the people who think you should be judged by the same rules, regardless of where you sit, the Islamophobia scandal in the Conservative Party is toxic. I sometimes feel we should spend more time on that, because we're a relatively small part of the British media, and the massive majority of the British media leans towards supporting the Conservative Party. But then that makes me unbalanced. So you can see how it happens for the best of reasons sometimes. But Islamophobia in the Conservative Party, anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, the hostile environment introduced by Theresa May, the endorsement of Rothschild conspiracy theories by Jeremy Corbyn, these things, for most, I still believe, and I'll go to my grave believing this, most of us are equally offended by it. It's only once you've tied the scarf around your neck and elected to scream abuse at the other side even when they're right, and to cheer support for your own side even when they're wrong, that's when terrible things happen. And the best possible distillation of that would come when Nazis march on American streets chanting, "Jews will not replace us," and the American president decides to talk about there being good people on both sides. That's how you end up in a place like this. How you get out of it, God only knows. The so-called Mir One mural that he liked on Facebook and then said it was by accident. I think we need a little bit of light relief. Do you remember when Withnell and I went on holiday by accident? There's a superb scene in one of my all-time favourite films when Richard E. Grant and Paul McGann, the titular heroes of Withnell and I, are sort of caught up in a monsoon in the middle of the North Yorkshire moors, and they can't find the cottage that they're supposed to be staying at, which is owned by Withnell's splendid Uncle Monty, played by Richard Griffiths. You haven't tuned into a film show by accident. We'll be getting back to the news agenda imminently. There's a supreme scene where Richard E. Grant, who's got that almost cadaverous face, hasn't he? I saw Don Quixote last night, the Man from La Mancha at the English National Opera. It's just lovely. It's such a lovely show, and it's got Kelsey Grammer and Nicholas Lyndhurst in it, who I think, pound for pound, that's pretty close to a World Heavyweight Championship of TV sitcoms. You've got Lyndhurst from the best British sitcom of all time, probably, and then Kelsey Grammer from two of the best American sitcoms of all time, both on the same stage. It was magical. Grammer's performance in particular was an absolute tour de force. But I have to just give a special mention to Peter Polycarpou, playing Sancho Panza, who I know he listens to the show. I don't know if he's listening today. Presumably they're sleeping off their celebrations from last night. But if you know Peter Polycarpou, would you tell him from me, he stole the show? And it was a brilliant show with lots and lots of brilliant performances in it. But Peter Polycarpou's Sancho Panza. And did you know that the film Dream an Impossible Dream, the song Dream an Impossible Dream comes from that show? Did you know that? No, nor did I. It did 2 or 3 stone cold bangers in that show. Anyway, I forgot why I mentioned that. Why did I mention that? Oh, yes, because Don Quixote, as you'll know from your Cervantes, was dubbed the Knight of the Woeful Countenance, which is such a beautiful phrase. He wanted a title that made him sound a bit posher, so he called himself the Knight of the Woeful Countenance. And I don't know why, but that just popped into my head when I was describing Richard E. Grant's cadaverous physog. And so he's there and he's all covered in rain and he's trying finding a farmer and they're trying to find somewhere to sleep, and he says something like, and I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, he says something like, "We've come on holiday by accident." And that seems pertinent this morning, doesn't it? 5 minutes after 11 is the time as we continue to contemplate Jeremy Corbyn liking a massively anti-Semitic graffito by accident on Facebook, or expressing opposition to it being removed by accident because he hadn't actually seen it or something. I can't even remember the details, but I keep thinking of that. That should have been the red card, my friends. That should have been the red card. But we don't care enough about anti-Semitism. And I've been guilty of that over the years. It just doesn't seem, because the Jews are so routinely portrayed as rich and privileged, it's hard for slightly lazy lefties to see them as being potential victims of discrimination and racism. That happens to people who are poorer than us. I am a white middle-class liberal, like almost all of Jeremy Corbyn's most slavish supporters. And we find it difficult to imagine people portrayed as wealthy and privileged as being victims of discrimination. We reserve our most passionate defences for people who are poorer than us and less educated than us, less privileged than us, because it makes us feel good. It's one of the rare occasions where the phrase virtue signalling possibly has some sort of meaning. But it's insane. It'd be like judging all Catholics by the Duke of Norfolk, or judging all Anglicans by the Queen. So, how are you going to riddle your way out of this one? If you still think Jeremy Corbyn is the absolute boy, how are you going to wriggle your way out of his endorsement of a book that states, united by the strongest bonds of organisation, always in closest and quickest touch with one as other, situated at the very heart of the business capital of every state, controlled so far as Europe is concerned by men of a single and peculiar race, who have behind them many centuries of financial experience, they are in a unique position to control the policy of nations. I'm going to go a little further now with that line there. This is just a few pages on from the foreword that Jeremy Corbyn wrote. United by the strongest bonds of organisation, always in closest and quickest touch with one as other, situated in the very heart of the business capital of every state, controlled so far as Europe is controlled by men of a single and peculiar race. Brexit? Jeremy's in Banstead. Jeremy, what would you like to say?
Well, weird connections. My cousin Robert Bierman was the photographic director on Withnail and I.
I love this. So sometimes when I go off on my mad tangents, I think I might lose the room or people will not know what I'm banging on about. But this is why we do it, because we can have a conversation that isn't mired in the difficult territory of the day. That is fantastic. Does he have any choice memorabilia?
Well, I don't see him very often.
No, fair enough.
He's a cousin through my grandmother, but
still worth taking it to the bank. I'd have that all day long. Get in the back of the van. What did you ring in to say, Jeremy?
Well, as a Jew, I have to tell a sad story of my first day at a council school in Morden on the largest council estate, I believe, in Europe. Where I moved from the private sector, where I was a failure educationally. But on my first day at this council school, the end of the previous term, the headmaster had proudly announced that the first Jew Jewish student would be arriving, and there was a reception committee waiting for me, who basically told me in no uncertain terms to go back to Jerusalem, where I'd never been at that time in my life.
Let me pause you there.
Yeah.
And I want to just be sure I'm going to say what I'm about to say, because when I started at prep school, and a couple of lads would accuse me of having supported the IRA because I've got an apostrophe in my name. And I'd never been to Ireland at that stage. To my eternal shame, the first time I went to Ireland was as a guest of Boyzone, but we never mentioned that in public. It's different because why is it? Because that was war. I mean, it bothered me a bit, and it probably bothered me more than a bit because I still mention it now. But in my mind, that is something I can shrug off, and also in my mind now, as a 47-year-old man in 2019, it's not the same as you being a victim of anti-Semitism. And we could mention the Holocaust as being, but the Irish potato famine, the appalling oppression of the Irish people by the English. Why does it feel different? Is it because you still feel threatened?
No, I don't feel threatened at all.
What is it then?
Because I've made my own life.
Of course. I
think big. I was attacked twice. Once I was told to go back to Jerusalem. The second time, someone got some dry ice from the ice cream van that called regularly by and pushed it into my face, which made the flesh freeze solid and the skin over the top of the frozen flesh wrinkle. And it was very painful. And that time I was told I'd killed Jesus.
So that was because you were Jewish?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
And that's the thing, because I went to a Catholic monastic school, as you may know, and we never really talked about Jews, except in the context of the Bible, and that's where that kind of nonsense comes from. You killed Jesus.
It underlay the rise of Nazism.
Of course it did. It must have done it, because it's there, and here it is in 1902. Here it is, blaming the Jews for every crikey. We hadn't even mentioned the Nazis. I forgot about the history. I'm too busy banging on about how the State of Israel didn't even exist when he wrote this stuff, so the usual fig leaf and camouflage doesn't work. But this was 20 years before Hitler started putting pen to paper in prison, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, there are things that I've realised over the years as I've grown and developed. One was sitting in the middle of the conference hall at Amnesty International, listening to an Israeli and a Palestinian talking about how they were organising a tour of the world to explain sympathetic views to each other. Yes. And I suddenly realised that the human being is a tribal animal.
Yeah.
Whatever it splits into, it will always attribute, whether it's rich versus poor, whether it's Labour versus Conservatives, whether it's Jews versus Arabs. It goes throughout the world.
But then there's always somebody standing between the two tribes saying, why can't we all just get along? So I take your analysis. Well, usually I am, but not always. There's plenty of people who well, yes, I am that person. You're very kind. I'm not going to do any false modesty. But and there are millions of people like us throughout history where you just say, why can't we all just get along? There's millions of them, and they seem to really get up the noses of the arch tribe. Sorry, yes, of course you can.
Can I speculate that your experience of prejudice had the same effect on you as it did on me? It turned me into a universalist, into someone who, one of the most delightful things I've done in recent years was to share the breaking of my fast at Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, where you fast with some Muslim friends who, it happened that the end of Ramadan was the same night. And we all got together and we had the most wonderful evening together.
And why wouldn't you?
To me, that's enriching.
Yeah, of course it is.
The other thing I have to say, to do specifically with the Labour Party, is that one of my friends, who is Jewish, was suspended from the Labour Party for anti-Semitism for 5 days because of his views on Israel. And I think there's a great deal of conflation going on between the conduct of Israel and its politics and Jews around the world.
Which is why I find this story like an oyster knife, because it predates the formation of the modern State of Israel. So all of these attempts, which I've always found unconvincing and slightly facetious, all of these attempts to say, no, I'm not criticising all Jewish people, I'm criticising the modern State of Israel. You can't use that if you're writing a foreword for a book published in 1902.
That's true. But today, the declaration recently by Netanyahu that Israel was a country just for Jews, to me, seems tantamount to Nazism. And that's one of the reasons that some people can justify continuing with this trope.
It's a deeply, deeply racist policy, in my opinion, undertaken by Benjamin Netanyahu and rejected by millions of Jews like you, Jeremy. And do you know the maddest thing I've learnt recently? You know when Trump was moving the embassy and he turned up with evangelical Christian preachers?
Yes.
I've looked in a little bit, and it's very much early days, but I've looked into this a little bit, and I'm sort of thinking, what the hell are you doing? Why does the very, very right-wing Israeli establishment court these kind of people? And why do these people who would historically be very anti-Semitic court the very, very right wing of the Israeli establishment? And the only answer I've come up with is that there's a brand of American evangelicalism that is in favour of the State of Israel because they think that all Jews will have to move there one day.
Well, no, it's not just that. It's because there's an event when Jesus comes back.
The reckoning.
I've forgotten the name of it.
So have I.
The something or other.
Yeah.
And they're keen to foment that.
So, of course, Judgment Day of sorts. That's not the correct, the technical term that you're looking for, and that will a sorting, as it were, a sifting, a separating, and that you're right. They are in favour of that. And that I think, like you, is probably the most depressing thing of all. Is that you sit here and you think that you're understanding things anew, or you think that you're redrawing the battle lines, or you think that you're illuminating, educating, learning, and then you realise it's gone on for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Even last night I mentioned Don Quixote and the Man from La Mancha at the English National Opera, which you should go and see if you get the chance. It's a humdinger of a musical. And the Spanish Inquisition, of course, is lurking in the background, where you'd get burnt to death by the Catholics for saying stuff that the Catholics didn't like. And you hop over to England during the Reformation. You look at the aftermath of Henry VIII. You get burnt to death for being a Protestant while Bloody Mary was on the throne. Fast forward 6 months, Sister Elizabeth is on the throne. You get burnt to death for being a Catholic. And I don't know why. I don't know why I grew up thinking that all of that happened to a different species, not to us. Now you look around and you see, of course it happens to us. And the way people talk about George Soros, that is proof of the pudding. It's naive, I suspect, of people like me not to have realised that the left do it as well. And now what you get is, of course, people hearing what I'm saying, and they'll pick the bits they like. So people on the left will buy into the my depiction of the anti-Semitic portrayals of George Soros, and people on the right will buy into the depictions of the anti-Semitism of Jeremy Corbyn, instead of being equally disgusted by both, which is what Jeremy means when he says universalist. Why aren't you equally disgusted by both? Why is Trump allowed to do things that get defended by one or two people in the British media that if they were done by Jeremy Corbyn would be utterly, utterly beyond the pale? And vice versa. Just a quick heads up. Our friend Peter Gagan and Jenna Corduroy over at Open Democracy have done another sterling job. Did you know that you're not allowed, the European Research Group, MPs claim money on expenses that they then give to the European Research Group? I should have told you this ages ago. As long ago as 2017, it was well over £250,000 that had taxpayers' money that had made its way into the coffers of the organisation that wouldn't disclose who was in it, and which, of course, regardless of what you think about Brexit, the failure of Theresa May to deliver any form of Brexit lies firmly at the feet of the so-called European Research Group. But Peter's been worrying away at this for some time, because he wanted to know who was in it, and they wouldn't tell him. Well, they have now, and you can read all of that over at Open Democracy, or you can just follow. I've linked to it on my Twitter feed. It's quite incredible, actually, to reflect upon how secret it is. Hundreds of thousands of pounds in public money, and it's often described as a group of Conservative MPs. Turns out it isn't. Among the 20 recipients of an email that Steve Baker sent out a couple of years ago were the former Labour Minister and leader of the SDP, David Owen, a Tory MEP, and a chap called Shankar Singham. Wait for it, trade advisor at the Institute of Economic Affairs, who has been described as having unfettered access to government ministers. So you remember that thing I said a minute ago in the altogether more important context of racial hatred, and saying, why can't we all agree to abide by the same rules? So if you hear somebody talking about George Soros on the right, or someone talking about the Rothschilds on the left, why can't we be equally disgusted? This is not me being holier than thou. I am. I read the stuff about the Rothschilds in this book that Jeremy Corbyn endorsed and described as brilliant. And I hear people talking about George Soros. And I hear the same thing. I hear the same ancient hatreds being stirred and revivified. I don't think, oh, well, I'm a lefty, so it's all right when my lot do it, or I'm a righty, so it's all right when my lot do it. That seems... I need older people to talk to me about whether it's always been like this and it's only recent events that have highlighted the fact that nothing has changed, or whether things have changed a bit. I think back to political correctness. Before it became a dirty word, before it even became a phrase, before anyone knew what it meant. And it seems to me that people did know what they were doing, that they were trying to erase these ancient hatreds from society, and of course they overreached the stories about Bar black sheep and blackboards, even if they were true, would have done so much more damage because of the forces of reactionaries, people who don't want to move on. And look at British politics today. Think of a British politician who routinely maligns George Soros, and ask yourself whether or not he or she wants to move away from ancient hatreds or wants to resurrect them. Yeah, exactly. Back to Jeremy. Yossi's in Luton. Yossi, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I would like to make a few points before, if that's okay.
Well, we'll see.
I'm a Labour supporter. I'm not a Corbynista. I think that Corbyn is to put it nicely, is a bit of a problem to the Labour Party. I'm a Jew, and I'm Israeli. Now, the last bit, I think, is the most important one, because maybe as an Israeli, I'm more of a, I'm not as fine-tuned to sense anti-Semitism. But I think that this whole Corbyn debate on the forward to Hobson's book is a bit of a red herring, to be honest. And the reason,
I hope you can persuade me. I really do.
Let me tell you. Let me explain to you.
Yes.
First of all, you very aptly mentioned the fact that today is Yom HaShoah in Israel, and obviously, and I had family.
Not just in Israel.
Well, it's for me, it's Yom HaShoah. It's the Israeli Yom HaShoah.
Okay.
Okay, if I do apologize if I take
well, I'll be lighting a candle in Chiswick for what it's worth.
That's fine. That's very respectable. But for me, Yom HaShoah is Israel. It's an Israeli thing, and the date, it's Yom HaShoah in Gvura. Yes. It's the date. It's a day of the Shoah and of valor, if you will.
Yes.
Commemorating the beginning of the rebellion in the Warsaw Ghetto. But the thing is this: I'm a history student from Tel Aviv University, and I studied Hobson's book in the class that was on the history of the West. And it was a class concerning imperialism, the rise of imperialism in the 19th century. Now, Hobson's book is a classic. Whether I like what he's saying in there, it's not as important as the fact that Hobson's book influenced many scholars of history.
I'm just going to pause you briefly, unless I've misunderstood you. You. As a student of history, you're absolutely right in what you say. But as someone who wrote the foreword to the book, the standards are profoundly different.
I think...
So I might read Mein Kampf for academic reasons, but I wouldn't write a foreword describing it as a brilliant tome.
I would say, look, I happen to
come on, you can't respond that quickly to what I've just said. There's quite a powerful point there.
I want to respond to that. I do want to respond to that. I do. Look, I had, when I was waiting to discuss, to have this conversation with you, I had a switch in my mind because I was about to say how ridiculous this attack on Jeremy Corbyn is, but then you and the other speakers made a point that fine, it is. Even in my mind, as someone who studied history, I do consider Hobson's book to be brilliant in his analysis of imperialism, up to the point that he goes obviously to his anti-Semitic rant about Jews controlling everything and all that kind of stuff, which, by the way, probably affected another very important document that appeared 3 years later, which is the Protocols of Elders of Zion.
Yes, well, precisely.
So there is that thing. And what you said about Jeremy Corbyn, that yes, even in my mind, as a Jew who's offended by these rants and who considers Hobson's book to be a classic, if you will, the fact that Jeremy Corbyn did not distance himself from that anti-Semitism expressed in the book is troubling.
Troubling?
Is it? I'm being British. Not Israeli. I'm trying to curb my Israeli.
Okay.
So well, you don't want to be fined for the words that I will be using.
No, okay.
So what I'm trying to say is that it's a huge problem. I do not think that Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite. I don't think he is. If you want to look at anti-Semitism, go back to Viktor Orban, and a little probably unknown story is the fact that Viktor Orban is unfortunately a good friend of my Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu. And it so happens that Mr. Netanyahu, and you can see that lot, Netanyahu, Salvini, some members of Likud expressed their support for Vox.
Yes, in Spain.
Not to mention
Front National in France, Farage in England.
We're talking about the same cesspool, if you will.
Yes.
And Yair Netanyahu, the son of Benjamin Netanyahu, posted on his Twitter feed a caricature of that is.
I'm going to, Yossi, just pause there. I'm going to come back to you after the news because I sense that we're barely started, and I'm very interested in what you have to say for a whole heap of reasons, not least your masterclasses in understatement. It's 11:30. We'll be back imminently, straight back to the phones where we cut Yossi off in his prime as he, essentially attempted to explain why Jeremy Corbyn's endorsement of a profoundly anti-Semitic book, championing of a profoundly anti-Semitic book, full of profoundly anti-Semitic tropes and traditions, doesn't mean that Jeremy Corbyn is himself anti-Semitic, although, for the record, if you're just tuning in, Yossi is no fan of the man. Where were we, Yossi?
We were discussing... I was trying to explain why I don't think that
yes.
Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semitic. And, I mean... I must say I'm not. I don't think he is, because anti-Semitism, again, being an Israeli, and it is important to understand that.
Yes, I do.
The view of anti-Semitism, the Israeli view position of anti-Semitism is bred on what we've been taught in Israel about what anti-Semitism looks like. And it doesn't look like our traditional anti-Semite. Funny enough, what I was about to tell was that Yair Netanyahu, the son of Benjamin Netanyahu, was published on his Twitter feed. He took a picture of an anti-Semitic cartoon and photoshopped it to put members of the opposition, and on the top, and the biggest figure there was George Soros as supporter of that. So that's what anti-Semitism looks like to me.
Even when the son of the Israeli leader does it.
Yes, that is anti-Semitic.
I agree with you. I feel that my agreement is less valid than yours somehow as a non-Jew and a non-Israeli, and yet I mean, that complicates an already horribly complicated issue. So a Netanyahu can be anti-Semitic in the public space.
No, Netanyahu is not supposed to be anti-Semitic, but the fact is that he uses anti-Semitic.
Well, what's the difference, Yossi? No, I'm not disagreeing with you. I know, I'm just asking you what the difference is between someone who you can describe as being anti-Semitic and someone who you can describe as doing anti-Semitic things. And obviously, if you're a Jew, it's probably easier to say he's doing something anti-Semitic. I mean, it's the converse of the self-hating Jew, isn't it? That is the line that's usually used by far-right Israelis to describe people who don't like their far-right policies. But that distinction you draw is fascinating to me. He does anti-Semitic things, he endorses anti-Semitic books, but I don't think he's an anti-Semite. That's what you're saying to me.
I don't think he's anti-Semite because anti-Semitism. No. Let me explain that.
I will.
Anti-Semitism to me has a. And I'm open to be convinced. I'm not fixated on.
So am I. It'll never catch on. It'll never catch on. So am I.
I must say, I find. Maybe I am too much of a Labour supporter because I can't, in the life of me, think that the party that stood up with Jews in Cable Street could be anti-Semitic. I'm a social democrat, and I can't for the life of me think that social democracy can espouse any type of racism, and historically it didn't. So there is a problem of anti-Semitism in the left. And you need to go you can read from Stalin and what he did to the way that he portrayed and the Soviets, the way that they portrayed Jews as the plutocracy of the world, and the way that the whole conspiracy theory, and there is an ingrained anti-Semitism in the left, in the far left, I would say. It seems to me...
But that's a conflation of great wealth with Judaism, isn't it? It's we blame the very, very rich pullers of strings for a lot of the problems in society, and we can make that target easier to describe if we call them Jews. Yes.
You give them a sign, you give them a nose, you give them an appearance.
Yeah. You put them on a mural, you have them playing chess or Monopoly on the backs of oppressed minorities with their hook nose. Oh, hang on, that's another Jeremy Corbyn story.
I agree to that. I must say, again, let me put it to you this way. My problem with, to be honest, my problem with denoting, blaming Jeremy for being an anti-Semite is you might find it silly. I don't think he's sophisticated enough.
I knew you were going to say that. I said to Ava in the break, Yossi is knocking at the door of saying he's not sinister or sophisticated enough to be an anti-Semite. He's too thick.
In that sense, yes. Yeah.
And that's where I get scared, because that distinction then between endorsing, promoting, championing anti-Semitic tropes and sitting in a dark room somewhere coming up with a way of persuading people that George Soros is somehow their enemy, or persuading people that the Rothschilds are somehow their enemy. They are different things. I completely get it, but I think you give him I think you're letting him off, mate.
Could be. I'm not. Again, I said I'm not. I can't honestly say. By the way, there are members of Labour, even in Parliament, that are blatantly anti-Semitic. By the way, not just Labour. I don't know if you remember this issue with Lady Tong that was talking about the worst kind of with a bloodline.
And there is a distinction between what Corbyn has done and what some of the people you're thinking of have done, and I understand that.
Or Ruth George.
Well, hang on, I haven't got all the details in front of me to be as au fait as you are with just veering into defamatory territory. I remember the Jenny Tong story. Okay. That's all right. Okay. I mean, if we need to set any record straight, I'll do that. And you've had broken records for the amount of time that I've given you.
She apologised.
Good. But before you go, how familiar are you with that story of the mural, the Mere One mural? Did you follow that one closely at the time as well, shortly after it became?
It was in the back, and it was on my Facebook feed. And again, I'll be honest with you. being fully convinced that Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite.
Yes.
To be honest, I probably, said, "Oh, what the hell? I mean, why should I bother with that?"
Yeah, well, and I think I did as well. And I'm neither Israeli nor Jewish, but I care deeply about these things, and I care more and in different ways every year, as you do. I'm always open to persuasion, always open to movement. I'm cracking on only, Yossi, because we're going to move on to something else in after the 2:45 break, and I want to squeeze in at least Sylvie in Harrow, who's been very patiently waiting while you and I enjoyed, I hope, I certainly did, that encounter. I'll just give you the penultimate paragraph of Finkelstein's column, Daniel Finkelstein's column in the Times today. It was him that essentially blew the lid off this story late last night. Did Corbyn not read the book before he praised it? Did he read it but, as with the Mere One mural, not notice that it was anti-Semitic? Did he realise it but decide it didn't matter because there were other more important things about it? And those are some of the questions that Yossi has also posed. Last word on this, I think, to Sylvie, who is in Harrow. What's it going to be, Sylvie?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Thank you for putting me on.
You're welcome.
What I wanted to say was, I'm so weary and tired of Brexit. I'm a staunch Remainer, and I've been listening to you and listening to your callers over the past 3 years, and now, in 3 years, I cannot even vote for Labour anymore. I don't know what we're going to do with this man, Jeremy Corbyn. He isn't very bright, which is, in my opinion, very frightening.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I just, in 2019, we seem to be going backwards.
Yep.
Labour, when Gordon Brown, Blair was in charge, centre ground, great.
Social democracy.
I'm now totally and utterly homeless, James. I cannot vote. And this man could be our Prime Minister. I mean, I don't like Trump. Nobody likes Trump.
Well, that's not true.
If you're a leader, you've got to sit down with people. You can't just put your personal, he'll sit down with Putin.
Well, we don't know that. Seamus Mills certainly has on a stage in public. But the Trump parallel, I'm a little bit torn on, oddly, for the very simple reason that Trump can be portrayed as being here as a representative of the American fallen, even though he has maligned the memory of American soldiers himself.
And that's why he should be there.
Yes, except that Trump then maligns the memory of American soldiers and insults the parents of a dead captain and insults John McCain, a bona fide war hero. There's all sorts of nuances here. I think he should have... well, for what it's worth, Sylvie, because you paid me the compliment of sharing your thoughts, I think Jeremy Corbyn should boycott that banquet. No, I think the Labour leader should boycott the banquet, but I don't think that Jeremy Corbyn can because of the people he's been happy to break bread with and talk to in the past. Does that help?
And I love this country,
yes.
And I'm very near the age of your mummy, and I just cannot believe that His Majesty's. I just can't believe that Her Majesty's opposition. We could have all these problems with anti-Semitism when it was never like that before he was leader.
And that's how I see it as well, actually. And I don't know whether it's as powerful a point as I think it is, but to remind us all that 4 years ago the Labour Party in this country was led by a Jewish man, albeit one that made a pig's breakfast of eating a bacon sandwich. A few of you are asking, where are these politicians in British public life who routinely seek to endorse the tropes regarding George Soros? My apologies, I should have been clearer.
I really feel that Soros, in many ways, is the biggest danger to the entire Western world.
Be funny if it wasn't so terrifying. We will actually, on reflection, take this up to 12 o'clock. After that, a couple of contenders for your attention. I've got a peach of I've got a new game. I've also got a new producer. Whenever I get a new producer, I try to enact new things on the programme, and then I forget about them, and they never happen. But things are going to be different this time. And we are every day, or pretty much every day, going to have a look at the things that the tabloids are telling me to get furious about, that I don't understand why I'm supposed to be angry. Because they're beautiful emblems emblems of modernity. People who have probably not bought a packet of sweets in Marks and Spencer's in their lives are today furious about packets of sweets in Marks and Spencer's. I shall tell you more imminently. I shall also tell you a little bit about the £89 million worth. Do you know what this means, Keith? £89 million worth of procured capacity will be sold back to the market? No? Well, we'll work it out. It's all to do with the Department of Transport and that no-deal Brexit ferry contract with the companies that actually had ferries, not with the ones that didn't have any ferries that Chris Grayling originally gave the contracts to, potentially. The ones that ended up with the contracts. That was just 13.8 million quid for the company that had never sailed a vessel. We look today at the termination of the other contracts with Brittany Ferries and DFDS, which will cost could cost, it's reported today, the taxpayers tens of millions of pounds, despite the fact that some of the £89 million worth of procured capacity will be sold back to the market. Oh, I see. So we don't need it anymore. It's just a question of how much we get refunded. I'm going to cautiously suggest to you that if Chris Grayling had anything to do with drawing up the contracts, we'll probably have to pay them. That's a joke. Satire fans. 11:51 is the time. Let's cross live to Southwark Crown Court, where Rachel Venables has news of Julian Assange.
50 weeks in jail. That's what Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks founder, James, has just been handed to him here by the judge at Southwark Crown Court. I think you should be able to pick up the sounds of his furious fans. Many of them were in court for the sentencing. They cheered and screamed as he raised his fist to them as he was led away. And then the second he left the courtroom, they turned on the judge. They turned on the court and started screaming things like "shame on you" at the judge. And then security had to lead them out here to where they are now, set up outside the main entrance, as you can hear, bellowing away things like "justice for Julian Assange." But this, of course, is a really crucial step. You'll remember Julian went into the Ecuadorian embassy 7 years ago to escape extradition hearings to Sweden. That was breaking bail, and it was for breaking bail that he has just been convicted. He's been convicted a couple of weeks ago, and he's just been sentenced to 50 weeks in jail, so very close to the maximum. The maximum sentence he could have received here today was a year.
How long is he expected to serve? I apologise if you told me that. I couldn't hear because of the rabble in the background.
Of course, I'll try and shout a little louder.
No, there's far too much shouting.
Far too much shouting already. Yeah, so he's been given 50 weeks. The judge will remove from that the time he's already served, which is coming close to just 3 weeks, because he's been remanded in custody, and he has to serve at least half of that sentence. So we could see him out in under 6 months based on things like good behaviour. I see. And the potential extradition is still in the game, so to speak. Yeah, very much rumbling on in the background. There's actually another hearing tomorrow at Westminster Magistrates Court on that. I don't think he'll appear in person. He'll appear via video link there, but that will continue. Another hearing tomorrow, more expected, we understand, through the coming months as well.
Rachel Venables, good work, as always, from Southwark Crown Court, where, as you've just heard, Julian Assange has been sentenced to 50 weeks for skipping bail, breaching bail. It is now 11:53. Do you want the story that you're supposed to get furious about, but you probably don't know what you're supposed to be getting furious about? Do you remember, I've told you this a few times, and I'm not going to lie to you, there's probably a little bit of false modesty involved. I don't have I hope this doesn't come as a major shock to you, but I don't have a spectacularly low opinion of my own gifts and talents. But I am great at pains often. Stop chuckling, Keith. I am at pains to acknowledge the things I'm not very good at. I think it helps mitigate some of the conceit. And I was very bad at spotting stories when I was a newspaper journalist. I was thankfully good at writing, so I was all right. But I would often, I've told you this a million times, I would often open the Daily Mail, which was our main rival when I was show business editor of The Express, and I'd see something I knew, which I hadn't really realised was a story. There was one example when they announced I'm going to forget this. They sent out a massive press release for a World Cup, like pages and pages and pages of how the BBC were going to do their World Cup coverage, and they'd hired someone who was controversial. I'd read the whole thing because I was quite interested in the World Cup, and I hadn't spotted... Oh, that's a really rubbish example. But anyway, I was in Marks and Sparks on Friday of last week, or possibly Saturday. I think it was Friday. Yeah, it was still the holiday, so it was Good Friday. Not Good Friday, it was Friday of like, this is going well. And we were looking for vegetarian Percy pigs because my youngest was having a party at the weekend, and she's rather partial to a Percy pig, which is a sweet you can buy in Marks and Spencer's, and she's a vegetarian. So obviously we bought loads of non-vegetarian sweets for all the other kids, but for her and a couple of her friends who are veggies, we were looking for the vegetarian Percy pigs and we couldn't find them. And I'm not saying it was panic stations, but it was certainly going to be casting a very small shadow over proceedings. And then, because she's cleverer than me, she picked up the normal-looking Percy pigs, had a look at the ingredients. And she said, Dad, look, they're vegetarian now. So there's no longer a vegetarian option and a Percy pig, which is a delicious sweetie, containing beef gelatine. I know what you're thinking. Beef gelatine? Until you've got a vegetarian in your life, you don't realise how hard it is sometimes to be... Yeah, there's beef gelatine in many sweets. Did you know that? So, for reasons I don't know, presumably fairly straightforward, they've just got rid of the non-vegetarian Percy pigs. So all Percy pigs are now suitable for vegetarians. They no longer contain beef. I'll put it like that, because you're going to learn that, again, I've missed a massive story. So sweets no longer contain cow, right? Good news or bad news in your world? Front page of the Sun. I knew this on Thursday or Friday of last week. I don't know what they pay for a splash these days, but a front page story in this. M&S has been accused of killing Percy Pig by sneakily turning all versions of the sweets vegetarian. It has stripped the treats of gelatine, and fans say they now taste like washing up liquid. The editor of The Sun is a man called Tony Gallagher, who presumably signed off on this. On the front page, they accused the store of pandering to veggies and declared bring back Percy. Oh, it's almost as if the people that The Sun have told you to hate on for the last 10 years, the Muslims, the immigrants, the Romanians, the Poles, the trans people, the gays, the Pakistan, whoever it is, none of it's turned out to be true. Who can we get you to turn on next? Because immigration isn't the reason why you're poor. It's people like Rupert Murdoch. And he owns us, so we can't mention him. So now we're going to go after vegetarians. Presumably very few people, with the exception of Cabby David Sheehan, 52, who fumed, wait for it, Percy pigs tasted fine before. Why did they change them for the Veggie Brigade? The Veggie Brigade? What do you want? Cow in my sweets. When do you want it? Now! That's the front page of the country's best-selling newspaper today. And you wonder why the population keeps voting to punch itself in the face. Cow in sweets. So that is today's episode of things I'm supposed to be furious about, but just can't even begin to understand. For what it's worth, doesn't really have much impact on flavour, the gelatine. It's all about texture. And I suspect it's more expensive for M&S to make them without the gelatine. So instead of getting that chewiness, you get a really agreeable clagginess from the vegetarian Percy pigs. They melt in your mouth a little bit more quickly because they don't have gum in them, effectively. The beef gelatine is gummy. It's the stuff that you add to recipes, isn't it, to make them congeal. So there's a more pleasant sort of... But they're fruitier, I guess, is what I'm saying, which is what you'd expect when you remove cow from something that's fruit-flavoured. It ends up being a little bit fruitier. But if you've got your head up your fundament, that is your reason today to get cross about something. Never mind anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, fascism in the White House, or indeed utter incompetence in Downing Street. Today, the best-selling newspaper in Britain wants you to get cross about the removal of cow from some sweets. Will it work? 3 years ago, I'd have said no way. Today, I'm going to say probably. It's coming up to 12 noon. What do you want to do after the break? I've got two stories. One about lessons that offer fairly conclusive proof that simply spending a little bit of money seeking to combat the gazillions that are spent encouraging us to pour poison and sugar and fat and all manner of disgusting concoctions, not even mentioning cow, down our children's throats, can be stemmed if we put a little bit of effort into giving healthier messages to parents.